Howdy, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Matt Olson, or Matty-O on the forums. Today I'm going to be talking about pressure testing crankcases for chainsaws. Many people end up in the same situation where your saw no longer starts, especially after loaning it out. You go to start it and it doesn't start, and it pulls over a little bit on the easy side. And during the breakdown you find this. A piston with some score marks on it, and of course the corresponding problem with the cylinder. The knee-jerk reaction is just to put a new piston and cylinder on the saw and keep running it. Now if you know that somebody straight gassed the saw, that makes sense. But on the other hand, if you don't know why it scored in the first place, you run a very high risk of destroying another perfectly good piston and cylinder. One common reason for a saw running lean and scoring the piston and cylinder is air leaks, particularly at the crank seals. Pressure testing for these leaks helps rule out bad crank seals and base gaskets. What I'm going to do is demonstrate the diagnostic procedures for a couple of very popular chainsaws, namely the Husqvarna 372 XP and the Stihl MS200T top handle. So let's do the diagnostic procedures that'll help prevent scoring and blowing up your top ends in the future. So this is a 365 or 372 crankcase, and I've got it apart far enough where we've got the crank seals exposed. So this is one, and the one on this side is a little bit screwy of a configuration because there's a bushing involved. But these are both the crank seals now exposed. The other thing that we have fairly readily accessible is the base gasket area. Now, some people run without base gaskets. I happen to use them. That's a long story, but you can see the rest of my videos if you want to go through that. The main goal of pressure testing is to make sure these crank seals are still good. So how do we do that? We have to actually induce pressure into the inside of the cylinder, into the crankcase itself. The problem with that is that there are so many different places for pressure to escape from. So you have to block off the carburetor, the intake area, with a piece of rubber. So all you do is cut a piece of bicycle inner tube and put it between the carburetor and the intake boot there. And then what you do is you cut a piece of rubber and you put it between the muffler and the cylinder head, and that blocks that off. Then we've got the spark plug and the decompression port. Now this one is plugged for demonstration purposes right now. In a minute I'll remove that and I'll actually use a decompression valve, and we'll show you what an air leak looks like there. So let's get this up to pressure. Now you want to test pressure with about 7 pounds. So the way to do that ideally is with a midi vac. So this one happens to be the Silverline Ultra automotive test kit. There's a bunch of other block off pieces of rubber that are part of the kit, but this certainly helps to test this type of thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the impulse line here, which is just a piece of rubber going into the internal part of the crankcase, and we're going to attach the midi vac like that. Put it to pressure, pump it up to 7 pounds. Pretty steady. Then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take some soapy water and put it right on the crank seal. So if that's dropping, then you want to put a little bit of soapy water right here on the crank seal, and you want to look for bubbles. And if you can really put it upright so you kind of create a puddle there, that's best. No bubbles here. That seal is perfectly good. So the other thing you're going to want to do is rotate the crank around its rotation, around its axis, with you can use a flywheel nut. Just rotate it, and that way you can watch the pressures as they go up and down. They should go up, they should go down, but they should be fairly solid and not dropping. The other thing that we want to do is kind of the same thing. we want to do vacuum. Sometimes saws will hold pressure but not vacuum. So hook up your midi vac again. And pull a vacuum. It should hold and it should be steady. Darn steady if you ask me. So this is a good pressure test. On this crankcase, it clearly holds vacuum, it holds pressure, which means at the minimum the crank seals and the base gasket are good to go. Let's demonstrate what an air leak does look like. So the easiest way to demonstrate what an air leak looks like is to use a decompression valve. So again, we put pressure in the system. About 7 pounds is good. Little soapy water here. As far as I'm concerned, most decompression valves leak at least a little bit. But let's see if we let the decompression valve go. You see the bubbles? There's the bubbles. So that's what a leak looks like. You can test with the soapy water on this side as well, which I highly recommend you do. And use spray. You can put soapy water in a spray container and just spray it all around the base gasket to check for leaks there. So before I get to the other saw, just want to pull this apart for you so you can see exactly what the rubber looks like. So pull the muffler. And this piece of rubber I actually doubled up, but that's what seals against the cylinder. And then on this side, might as well do the same thing. One thing I have noticed is the rubber does tend to want to bunch up. So you do have to enlarge the holes at least a little bit so that the screws don't tend to get the thing all bunchy. Here's a hot tip on the 365s. If you find that you're doing your pressure testing and you can't spin the crank, there's a reason for it. It's because you were smart and you blocked off the 2 holes for the oiler here with some screws, which is exactly what you needed to do in order to get a seal, because otherwise the holes for the oiler actually go into the crankcase itself. Once you get rid of those, you can spin the crankcase completely freely. So now you can spin it freely. So you have to actually use shorter, probably 10mm bolts will work so that it doesn't run into the crank itself. And that way you can seal up these holes, and that will, of course, help you do your pressure test. So let's move on to the next saw. So this is a Stihl MS200T crankcase here and the exhaust. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this piece of rubber to help with the blocking plate, which is the exhaust. Just a regular little paper punch. It's going to hold this piece of rubber here in place. So I've got the 2 exhaust bolts here with a piece of rubber, and that's going to do the sealing. You can do this on the saw as well, or rather while the saw is more together than this, but we're just demonstrating how to do a pressure test here. So you watch this go down. Make sure the rubber doesn't bind and then bunch up, and then it won't seal. 1, 2 exhaust bolts. Now you should have the exhaust sealed. Now let's work on the intake. So the intake boot goes on like that. Then we have a plate here that actually seals the boot. That seals the boot. I've got these plugs, which will plug the intake here reasonably well, so I don't need to put the carburetor on and use it as a backing because that plug will be fine. But if you are going to use the carburetor as a backing, then what you want to do is you want to have a piece of rubber, just bicycle tube, punch a couple holes in it with a hole punch. Something that you'd use on a sheet of paper is fine. And then put the carburetor down over it, and that uses it. That creates a back similar to the exhaust. So now that that's there, what other holes do we need to plug? So on this motor, there's no decompression valve, so we don't need to worry about that. But there is a hole for a spark plug. So let's plug that. Now normally the impulse line connects underneath here to a nipple that's right here. But for purposes of this test, we don't need to connect it. We're just going to hook the mini vac right up to it. So remember I mentioned other places, other holes? Well, the oiler holes are here. 1, 2. So we hook the mini vac up to the impulse line. And sure enough, that is not sealing. Not at all. I need to figure out why. So part of the beauty of making videos is learning what you're doing wrong. And what I have wrong here is I have the seal in upside down. So, and this is exactly why we do pressure testing, because you can figure out that you've done something wrong. No wonder I can't generate pressure with the mini vac. That's got to be upside down. It's one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. I'm going to have to do a review on these seals later, but I'm glad I bought extra. So whenever you buy seals, you buy extra. So I'm going to change these out, and we're going to get the rest of the pressure testing video done so you can see what a proper result hopefully looks like. So let's continue with the pressure test. I've got new OEM seals installed here. I've got the base gasket put down with lots of sealant. That way this seals nicely all the way around, and an OEM seal on that end. So a couple other things to note. Whenever you're doing a pressure test, you have to block off all of the ins and the outs. So we're blocking off the intake, and this is just with a 3/8 inch extension. It actually works pretty well to block off the intake. We've got an old spark plug in the spark plug hole. There's no decompression valve here, so we don't need to worry about that. But if there was, you do need to block that or put the decompression valve in. Most of the time the decompression valves leak at least a little bit, so you have to keep that in mind when you're doing testing. The other thing on these cases, and it's the same on the Husqvarnas, the oiler has two screws, two bolts that bolt it down, and those often go right into the crankcase, so those need to be blocked as well. So now we take our mini vac, put it to pressure, run it up to 7 pounds. Well, there's your pressure test right there. That needle is steady. So 7 pounds, that's what you want. Now these seals do tend to weep just a little bit. Not a big deal. They're brand new. Give them some time. A tiny leak is not a problem. What we had before, whoosh, that's a problem. So you can take some soapy water to this, as much as you like. Put some soapy water on there. You can make sure it's not leaking. It ain't leaking. And you can test with soapy water anywhere on the base gasket or on the crankcase, anywhere you like. But if you notice that that needle is moving, you're going to want to find out where it's coming from. So let's switch to vacuum. And again, the needle is nice and steady. That's exactly what you want. And as you're doing that, another good thing to test for is just to take and run through the rotation. And as you run through the rotation, you're probably going to notice the needle moving up and down, but it should always come back to the same spot. There you have it. So, as long as that needle stays rock steady, you know, a little bit of drop maybe over a 5-minute period, probably not a big deal. There are specific numbers for that in the manuals for these saws of exactly what the specs are. But in general, if it holds and that needle looks steady, you're good. It's the big leaks you really want to make sure are gone. While we're at it, why don't we simulate a leak? So I've got the spark plug here loosened just a little bit. I'm going to pump this up to about 10. And you can see how that's dropping. That's not holding vacuum at all. Go to pressure. Pressure's nice because you can hear it. Often you can hear exactly where it's coming from. But that's dropping enough that that's a bad leak. You want to fix that. The way to do that is to tighten down whatever's leaking. So if the intake was leaking, if the spark plug was leaking, obviously you got to tighten those down so that you can find and properly diagnose what is going on elsewhere. Depending on your saw, there'll be different ways to block off the intakes and the exhaust, but you do have to block them. You don't really have any choice on that. So make sure you get a good blocking plate on the exhaust, a good blocking plate on the intake, however that's configured. And of course you can do this with the saw more together than this. This happens to be a really good illustration of, so you can see the seals and where the base gasket is attached. If you don't run through these tests before you go and put your brand new piston and cylinder in here, and you have not diagnosed why the failure originally occurred, then you are risking a brand new piston and cylinder all over again. If one of these seals was leaking pretty badly, if they were old, they really do need to be replaced. Think about it this way. If you have a car and it's 10 years old, all the rubber on it's shot. The ball joints, the boots on the CV joints, anything rubber on the car is going. A saw is really no different. And a lot of these saws that we're rebuilding are 10, 15, 20 years old, 30 years old. So what are the odds the rubber's still good? Not so good. So make sure you get a good evaluation of the seals. Make sure everything's blocked off properly, and you'll have a good pressure test. So those are the diagnostic procedures that we use on these two particular chainsaws. Although not all chainsaws are in this configuration, this will at least give you an idea of what you have to do in order to get your saw tested. I'd like to put a plug in for my sponsor, HL Supply. Make sure you click on the link in the description of this video if you're going to be buying some aftermarket parts. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to leave them in the comments section. And as always, thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.